With trying to keep things as streamlined as possible, we're going to keep our introductions to a minimum. I want to introduce John Wilbanks, who's coming to us from Sage Biosystems. They've been working in the area of data sharing, and John in particular has really transformed the way that people think about informed consent around genomic data. So he's going to introduce speakers, and then we'll move directly into a panel where we'll bring up the people from this morning as well.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for the invitation to be here. We have a fairly tight schedule, so we're going to dispense with detailed introductions. I assume everyone knows how to use search engines and look up our distinguished speakers. So this session is to look at platform providers of personal genomic data sharing services, along with some sense of the new kinds of technical platforms. If you have blockchain on your bingo card, this is your session. And we're going to talk about business models, consent processes, the hybridization of governance and technology, which I think all of us on this program care a lot about, and also think about engagement, feedback, and sustainability. So there's a reason why it's a pretty large group. At the end of this, we will call up members of the previous session and have a chance for more Q&A. Since we're going to have a lot of people, I'm not going to moderate and ask questions. We're going to take questions from you, including those of you on the internet. And if that flags, then and only then will I start asking questions. Our first speaker is Masa Shabani, who's joining us virtually, which is something that I hope to do more often myself.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Thanks a lot. I would rather be there, but of course it was not possible. But I'm really happy that I will be able to speak today about from the more perspective of the governance of data sharing, and why this is actually also important for all discussion when it comes to the data sharing. Next slide, please. So when we are actually speaking about data sharing, it's important to know that we are dealing with such sensitive data, and there it's really important to speak about good governance mechanisms in place, which regulate that indeed who can have access to data for which purposes. And this is, of course, it's even of more importance when it comes to big databases or consortia. And of course, so far what we had was so dealing with really different types of governance models, starting from more centralized data governance models, and also moving more in a more decentralized models. So what has been observed that for having more centralized models of data sharing, we need actually to have these well-functioning databases, first of all, but also it's important indeed to have these data access committees, which are kind of in charge to see that we can have access to these databases for which purposes, and indeed manage these access to these databases. Next slide, please. But what we have observed, and in the research that we have done also, that these centralized models are not really always functioning very well, and one of the shortcomings of this database, indeed these centralized models, which are based on centralized data access committees, are often they also lack representations of the individuals and also patients, which is, of course, we are indeed paying a lot of attention to that now also during this meeting. But also another concern is that it's not always very clear that what are the criteria for access to these databases. Are they very clear? Do we have enough well-established access criteria? And it's also important to know that because we are speaking about all this sensitive data, we want to make sure that those researchers or those that are getting access to data can be held accountable as well in a way that they are actually using this data. So indeed, response to some of the shortcomings of the existing centralized models of data sharing, they have been observing that some of the platforms are emerging, that they are proposing that they can use more new technology, which is in this case is a blockchain-based technology, that to answer some of these challenges that have been observed with centralized models of, indeed, governance models of data sharing. Next slide, please. So in a paper that recently published, I looked at some of these emerging platforms and some examples that they are actually proposing that they can use blockchain-based technology, which is indeed a decentralized or distributed network to address some of these challenges that's being observed by a centralized way of governing access to these databases. So it's probably not very visible from what you see in the slides, but it's included also in the paper. And these are the examples that indeed I looked at them, and with some indeed short description of each of these platforms. But also important for this discussion was to see that what these platforms are offering or suggesting in terms of or what the features they have, indeed, that they can address some of the current challenges with the governance of data sharing. So in the next few slides, I will just look at some of the major promises being made by these platforms and see that how they can potentially indeed improve what we have already when it comes to the governance of data sharing in a more like a larger scale database. So the first indeed important aspect that these platforms are indeed offering is that we move more from in a direction that we'll be having more distributed data stewardship, in a sense that authority is being able to be distributed among trusted actors rather than to be indeed to be just relied on one entity that indeed controls access to these databases. It could be like just one database or one data custodian. And then, of course, the advantage of this approach would be we will be having different partners that will be indeed part of this governance of these databases, and we will not be just trusting on one single party. But of course, when it comes to the genomic data and the scalability issues, it's also important to see that what can be actually put on this network, and in this case, in this blockchain-based network, because we are speaking about a large volume of data, and these platforms are often just promising that some aspects of this data governance, especially when it comes to the indeed issues about data ownership or viewership permissions, would be stored on chain. Next slide. The second feature of these platforms are indeed mostly focusing on the participatory access control. So that's what we are discussing also today, that indeed we should be able that if you are just setting up such databases or platforms, we are speaking about different stakeholders. So we have researchers collecting data, but we also have patients, individuals that this data belong to them. And ideally, we should be able to include them as well when we are deciding that who can have access to these databases or not. And so far, lack of infrastructure has been always indeed pointed as one of the reasons that it's not really possible to have as many stakeholders as possible in this governance model. But these platforms are indeed thinking that they can use this technology to include really different partners in the access control and access governance. Of course, because many information can be also stored on these platforms, Also some information about that, who can have access to these databases, for which purposes. Then this can also potentially help to increase transparency in the system, that in terms of the people that can have access data and the purposes that they are, indeed for that reason they are accessing data. Next slide, please. And also, of course, of interest is that because the centralized approach has been often pretty much focused on data access committees, they were functioning in person, but this approach can actually help as well to automate part of the process as well. And in this way, one of the indeed features that these platforms are offering is that be able to codify and execute the patient's authorization coming from consent form through different tools, such as, for example, smart contracts, to be able also to store this on-chain and make sure that you're actually respecting what's been included in these consent forms and what's coming indeed from the patient's perspective. Next slide, please. And then finally, it's indeed a discussion about the data ownership and different incentives that can be provided to the patients and also to the individuals that they are contributing data. So this is indeed one of the features of these platforms, that they are suggesting that patients and individuals that who own data, of course, there's always discussion about if you can speak about data ownership, if this is the correct term or not, but they should be able as well to indeed benefit from if this is going to end in any, for example, economic benefit, then they are just sharing their data. And in this way, they are sometimes, indeed, they are offering some incentives, some monetary incentives, for example, and takes different shapes like tokens, shares, and etc. Or sometimes, indeed, this is more like sequencing data just getting the sequence genome in exchange for data. So different, indeed, approaches to how to give these incentives to the individuals to share their data, but at the same time to make sure that they can also benefit from this data sharing. Next slide, please. So these has been so far has been really an overview of what has been promised with these platforms, but of course they are just, as I mentioned, these are the very emerging platforms, so still I think it's a long way to see that how much they can indeed succeed in what they are promising, but also they are already raising some points to discussion as well. That if I want to just highlight some of them here, is first of all is the rhetoric of controlling data. This is one thing that of course it should be also being taken into consideration, that when patients or individuals are sharing their data with these platforms, of course it's somehow a limitation as well, that how can they keep control on once they share their data with these platforms. And the other thing is more also applicability of the different data protection regulations. For example, now we have the EU General Data Protection Regulation, which is more tends to recognize specific data controller or data processor in the process. But if you speak more about the distributed networks or different indeed entities that they can take control of data, so then the question would be who should be held responsible if something goes wrong indeed in this process of data processing and processing such sensitive data. Next slide, please. And then the other question is about the research ethics and the research oversight. It's important to see that if you still consider this as a research activity, it's important to see that more in a conventional research setting. We are speaking about research oversight with the research ethics committees prior to starting the research. But of course here we probably will be also dealing with a different setting. That's also important to indeed to take this into consideration, to see that how we will be also monitoring the research that's being done through the data that's being collected through such platforms. And finally, and last but not least, is the issues that are related to the consent, and especially these are more pertinent when it comes to when we are offering such monetary incentives, and see that whether or not indeed this is really creating any influence on the individuals, or what should be the approach when it comes to for example, consent withdrawal, especially if individuals get their data in exchange for free sequencing, for example. And issues about privacy, which I don't have time to go into that, but this is also very pertinent, how much we can rely on these platforms to make sure that they are not really causing any, indeed, risk for the individuals that they are sharing their data. And also, finally, issues about the education and awareness about the potential risks, because, of course, we are speaking about a very emerging technology. It's offering something at this moment, these platforms, but we don't know that also in the future how much indeed this can create also some privacy-related risks for the individuals that are sharing their data through this platform. Next slide, the last slide. Thanks a lot, and I hope if you have any questions and so on, I'll be happy to answer. Thanks.
Thank you, Masa. So we have time to take we have time to take two questions if they're actually questions, which are short interrogatories with a question mark at the end, or we have time for one longer comment that ends with "What do you think?" If anyone wants to jump in, do we have any questions from the webcast? So there was a question, Masa, there was a question asking if you could clarify what a DNA token might be.
Yeah, so basically these tokens are mostly recognizable if you are part of these platforms. So you get somehow some kind of points or some tokens which are can be used again inside these platforms if you are indeed inside this. And of course, I think there's a silly question about the monetary value of these tokens, whether or not you can exchange them later on for anything else. But of course, it's mostly you can just see its value when you are inside those specific networks of data sharing. And indeed, it depends also as well on what type of data are you going to share and so on.
Masa, then I'll ask a second question. Can you talk a little bit about the intersection of ethics protection for research with the emergence of data protection law that you alluded to with your GDPR comment?
So basically, with the legal frameworks that I just referred to that there, it's really important that probably one of the most important things is that to make sure that when data that's being shared is not indeed re-identifiable. So it's the point that indeed it's important for the data protection regulation. But of course, when we are speaking about the ethics, we go a little bit broader as well, and we also are concerned that, for example, what type of research is going to be done with these databases, and whether or not these are also in line with the consent of the patients or individuals, if they're aware of that, or how broad would be the type of the research that will be done with these databases. So the different issues related to privacy, data protection, but also consent-related issues that they are all important when we are speaking about this type of data donation and data use.
Great, thank you. So let's give Masa a hand again, please. And next up, we have Adam Resnick. And Adam, I believe you're going to get like a beeping noise when the light goes yellow to red.
Yeah, I think you've seen me speak before. So it's a pleasure to be here today. And, the first panel was, incredibly inspirational. I myself was trained as a neuroscientist just up the road at Hopkins during the transition and coming of age of the first whole genome, which for the first time provided scientists like myself sort of the parts list and really solidified for us the idea that that biology was solvable, right? And for many of us who were training at the time, there was really a feeling that biology suddenly moved into that space that physics had been in for some time, that suddenly we can actually test hypotheses in a very discrete manner in ways that we could actually implement and drive forward. I'll try to talk today about how my own sort of trajectory in this context with my partners really informed a strategy to start building platforms and architectures to support the reality of actually driving this, because it turns out that unlike the physicists that have to study 9 planets or 8, depending on who you believe, we have millions and millions of human beings that we're trying to study. But the reality is that the discussion that you've heard today in the context of the personal genome is actually taking place in a phase transition that's occurring across every domain of the research architecture, not just about the role of the patient, but also the role of the researchers, institutions, and the NIH as a whole. And I think hopefully this panel can provide some context for this phase transition and emerging architecture. And the key part is that patients should be a critical partner and true constituent of that architecture. So I'll start with consortia and data sharing, because data sharing is not only a challenge for patients, but it's a challenge for researchers as a whole. As I mentioned, I began as a neuroscientist, and really focused on pediatric cancers, and more specifically, pediatric brain tumors, which, although are the leading cause of disease-related death in children, still fall into a category, like you heard from Corey, of being rare. In the context of trying to drive discovery, you are required to gather data, gather patient, gather information from very disparate sources in ways that you hope can mitigate the time to discovery and move forward. As a scientist, we made a transition in the context of genomics from a traditional thought space of the experimental model of making observation, hypothesis, experiment analysis, and conclusions into a big data context where data was supposed to transition from raw, unanalyzed data into structured data that constituted information as harmonized data that could then be driven into knowledge that could be analyzed and applied in the context of patients. And our job as scientists suddenly became not just to go through this funnel, but to find ways to accelerate that, because there was real tangible feeling that proximity to impact was completely associated with our capacity to interpret the biological context. And so suddenly we were forced to transition from individual laboratories working on our capacity to navigate tenure within boundaries of institutions that were really structured from 20th century models of research to thinking of a completely different way of trying to address this proximity to impact through collaborative architectures that were not inherently resident within academic research. Within brain tumors, we were successful to create consortia that then began initially centralizing biospecimens, but as you just heard, centralization can get you some things to work, but others not. And so even though we began centralizing biospecimens, we had to figure out ways to decentralize data and make it available. And in doing so, what became clear is something that the first panel highlighted, is that our measure of success is solving this equation. The recognition that because the premise is that within data there are solutions, every step you take to building infrastructure requires you to try and optimize for time. And historically, time is not the optimizing factor that's latent within research. But this is where patients, I think, actually can come in and completely transform the architecture. So consortia require cloud-based architecture to support this decentralized approaches. At least our consortia-based efforts began in such a way. And so we partnered with commercial and non-commercial entities, the NIH as well, to begin building architectures that supported this distribution of real-time data from consented patients in the context of research architecture. Now, this was an arduous task to get even to this point of collecting 1,000 whole genome across 30 different brain tumors. We participated in the Cancer Moonshot and launched this initiative. But what became clear is that if you're really going to optimize for time, there are design principles that have to be implemented. And again, these design principles are still in flux and not yet uniformly adopted, at least in the context of the emerging canvas against which we hope personal genomes have to be contextualized. So one, as you build architectures, they have to really support non-local data discovery processes through collaborative processes. You have to maximize for the number of information users, maximize for the diversity of information users, maximize for connectivity, and at the same time apply rules and architecture that support trusted communities to emerge and governance structures. Now that is something that is very challenging, particularly in the context of privacy and requirements to align with such privacy regulation, particularly in the research context. But at the same time, as you're doing this, you're aligning with the ways patients actually expect to interact with data. As these infrastructures began to emerge, as consortia-based requirements required us to think in a global structure for data, as those data sets really emerge in context with partnership with patients and foundation communities, at the same time, the NIH and many other entities began thinking of concepts of a commons. And one of the commons that we have a privilege in participating to work within in the context of a data resource center is the Kids First Data Resource Center. So we moved from consortia-based architecture to bring institutions together to NIH-driven architectures that bring communities together and government-sponsored data sets together in the context of Kids First. And this, again, was driven by patients and families and foundations, specifically the family of Gabriela Miller, who herself was suffering from a pediatric brain tumor. And again, you can see that even as a 10-year-old, her mandate, if you watch her YouTube video, is focused on time. Time is the optimizing factor that she is challenging us to actually drive towards. All patients understand that cures are the goal, but it's the time variable towards those cures that patients are challenging us to address. So the Data Resource Center, which is in its first year and a half, essentially, of existence, we began thinking about building such architecture that can support researchers, but at the same time began investigating and working with patients groups to think about what role could patients have in the context of building large-scale infrastructure. And I think this begins to address some of the questions we're hoping to address, some of the questions that the first panel brought up, which is to contextualize patients and empower them, they have to be connected into large-scale architecture. You can build your own or you can store your own data, but unless data is connected, you struggle to actually provide meaning. And that's the constant tension that you have. Protection and siloing data is at times at odds with adding value to its meaningfulness, because it's only through connection that value actually gets provided. And that's why it's so challenging to really think about how to build such a structure that allows contextualization of personal data while providing governance and control. But the commons really provide a context for how to think about community-based architecture. You heard earlier that you cannot just ask a patient to take their BAM file and interpret it, right? You have to build communities in the context of platforms that support shared discovery, ownership, and governance. For us, in order to actually drive this forward, we began very rapidly to understand that the healthcare ecosystem itself is not always aligned in the way that you actually heard from the first panel. And if you look, I just picked one example from the web, in the way that patients are contextualized as consumers of health as opposed to as producers or participants. That is what underlies many of the challenges for driving this process forward. And I'll end with a short vignette from one of our first patient participants within the context of these large-scale architecture, which, if he could be here, I'm sure he would have, which is Stephen Keating. So Stephen approached us early on as a pediatric or a young adult brain tumor patient, and I'll let him speak for himself for a second. I think. Play. There it is.
what it looks like up here, I can actually take a photo.
Here, we'll take this up.
An event.
Sorry for the technical trouble. Give us 2 seconds. There you go. Can you guys hear this?
We create, view, and share data every day. And an easy way to see this is with photos. So, for example, if you're curious what it looks like up here, I can actually take a photo. Everybody do like a goofy pose or wave or something like that. Ready? So it was an event. I documented it. Share it.
It's only 2 minutes long.
Data every day. And an easy way to see this is with photos. So, for example, if you're curious what it looks like up here, I can actually take a photo.
All right. It may not work, so we'll have to skip it. But what he actually ends up talking about is his own experience of participating in a study in which, by chance, he was discovered that he had a brain tumor. And he says it's much more likely that I'll be able to. But at the time, he, as an MIT graduate student, was deeply interested in every bit of his data. And he actually represents an extreme, but one that highlights the challenges of all patients. The first is that he wanted to get access to actually his genomic data. And then the second is that he actually wanted to find a place to host it. And when he talks about data, he means all data. He videotaped his surgery, so he uploaded all of his surgical data into different portals and environments. And he was the first patient that actually approached us and said, how can I upload my entire data set, which range from his 23andMe studies to his whole genome to every single pathology report, every radiology report, every single slide that was analyzed by a pathologist to move forward. And so he was the very first patient who did that. But it was an arduous task, right? Because he had to centralize, gather hundreds of terabytes of data, and then upload this data himself. Now, for us, we had no mechanisms at the time to support this. So what we actually ended up having to do from a regulation perspective to say, think of it as your Dropbox, right? You're in charge to upload your data. We can only provide you the tools. And so as an MIT graduate student, he was able to do that and uploaded the entirety of his data and then added a disclaimer in there that says it's for everybody to use. Now, that represents a tremendous, amount of work and effort for someone to do this. And so that presented us with the very first use case of the challenges that even for the most willing and able patients that fought through actually getting their genomic data from research-based studies or regenerating them and fighting in the courts, he talks about that in his video, it was extremely challenging to do. And so this brings to recognition that the platforms and resources you build, right, cannot just be at the endpoint of the position, right? You have to help patients all along the way from the hospital context to move them forward. And once you enter the platform, then the patients can interact with bioinformaticians and other resources, and that's what he was able to do. Once the data are in the platform, then other bioinformaticians and users, I did not contribute much, mostly other much more important people did. But once he was able to do that, he was able to contextualize his data with other resources, just like you heard from Corey. And you can see the diverse amount of data that he actually presented. Now, for me personally, right, it felt like a tremendous failure, right, when only a few months ago Stephen passed away, because he was one of those people who did everything right as a patient, right, to try and harness that proximity to impact as a patient. And so it brings to mind that, when he was doing this, he recognized, right, because he had the data, right, that he had some probability of not making it through. And so for him, the secondary, if not equal goal as a patient was to make sure his data prevents harm for future patients. And I think that's a critical component that oftentimes was mentioned briefly in the first panel, but something that I think we as a community oftentimes are mandated to think about, which is the patient's role in accelerating discovery is one component, But the responsibility we bear is that those patients' data, right, who oftentimes are generated in the context of the meaningless, meaning what I mean by that is that it's for no fault of theirs that they often, at least within our context, have a horrific disease, can have the ultimate meaning and the most long-lived meaning, right, as a patient who had control of their data by making it available for others on behalf of the community. But the key lesson for all of this was that we have motivated patient community who prioritize and position time as the ultimate factor, and that judge us by our success as researchers as to what decisions we have made as a community to put time as the number one factor that drives the decision-making process in building architecture, that these architectures then themselves cannot be built and cannot be structured in the absence of the recognition that if time is the factor we want to optimize, patients have to have an integral role because they're the only ones that can align the true motivational structures behind this. Otherwise, other motivations and incentives will take over. But if patients are part of that structure, right, they drive the optimization formula in the correct trajectory. So we hope to work with many of you in the future. And again, I was thrilled to hear the first panel's comments.
So same concept. If there's anyone who has a clean question, or do we have any from the internet? No? Okay, Adam, then I'm going to ask you one. And I think this is sort of where you ended with Stephen, which is, when we think about what we can promise to patients with personal control of their data and the limitations of that, how do we be honest about the potential, but also honest about the statistical probability?
Right, and I think what we found, and I think we heard some of this in earlier discussion, is that it's not for us to actually make the promises, right? We have a shared understanding that we, as a community, as humanity, believe that within data, right, there are solutions to be found, but that process is challenging and hard and can only be done as a community. And the recognition that I think is most important is that it's going to be a rare scenario where one institution or one clinician or one researcher can promise any one solution. And it's really structures like the commons or other architectures that harness community-based architectures that really drive the potential. But to your point, I think it's because we're in this phase transition where only now are we building these resources that can drive community-based input, decision support, decision-making that is not dependent on chance interactions, in conferences or at universities, that we can potentially really fulfill the promise, right? I think that's what's been missing from many of the previous trajectories that I think many of us have hoped to fulfill, but it's really the recognition that it's going to take all of us to fulfill that.
Great. So next up, Bastian Savoras.
Hello? Oh, okay, I think now there we are. So, good morning, everyone. I want to talk about what we are doing with Open Humans, which Misha has already briefly mentioned earlier. And the idea that we are pursuing in Open Humans is that we want to have data that is controlled by patients and that patients collectively can use for doing research together. And as we've heard, like with Stephen and many other people, it's in many cases the patients who are really the experts and who can bring so much, not only pressure in terms of because of it's about their time, but also the expertise of how they actually want to use their data. And we are not the first ones to actually acknowledge this, and if we go back to the 1940s, the visionary authors of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights already in Article 27 recognized that actually everyone has the right to freely participate in the cultural life of the community, which includes sharing in the scientific advancements and its benefits. And people see that this is a point where people actually have a right to participate in doing science and not just being research subjects. So how we try to address this in Open Humans is by providing an online community and an online platform and online tools for allowing people to import their data from a variety of sources for using this data. So The individual can import data into their Open Humans account from a variety of sources, and these resources are not only genetic, but so many people here in the room collect data from their phones, their wearables. You can even collect data about what you've Googled, where you've been, your social media usage. So all of us are having these huge data collections about ourselves these days, which are usually somehow distributed across the internet in different data silos in different companies. But of course, thanks to regulations like the GDPR, actually people have a right now, especially in Europe, to get access to all of those data, export it, and do whatever they want to do with this data. And so people have been building on Open Humans to import these data from a variety of sources. These are partially for fun, like look at your Twitter data, look at your Spotify listening history, but it's also genetic data, it's continuous glucose monitoring data, and if there's no data source that you are actually using here on the list, Open Humans is built around open APIs, and everyone can build their own data importers. For example, getting data from your iPhone, Apple Health, into Open Humans was built by a single community member who was like, I have an iPhone, I know how to program for my iPhone, I want to have this data in Open Humans, and he just went ahead and did it. So once your data is stored in Open Humans, the big point is that your data is stored privately and you can start using it without actually giving, as a patient or as a member of the community, access to this data to anyone else. And the first way to explore this data for especially these hardcore patients or these hardcore users like Stephen, who have like a lot of technical expertise and to actually know how to do a data analysis, they can start analyzing data using notebooks, write their own data analysis and share those. And as an example for genetic data analysis, here's one written by a community member, where a community member figured out which genetic variants are related to eye color, made a notebook, published it, and people can reuse and re-edit the notebook to see which eye color predictions they get from their genetic data. But one person who was interested not in eye color went ahead, and here's Maria, who actually wrote this over a beer after a conference to figure out how to use the same notebook and edit it to figure out whether she has any of the variants associated with preeclampsia. And she published the notebook again, so now other people can run the same analysis on Open Humans just using their 23andMe data, which is already in the system. And people go ahead and they make even more complex data analysis. Here's another community member actually from the DC area who wrote a data analysis which takes your 23andMe data or any of the other genetic data that's in Open Humans and puts you in the genome population space for the 1,000 genomes to see what's your ancestry. So this is the first case of how people can actually use their data as patients, and they don't even have to share the data with anyone. Basically, researchers could write data analysis tools for patients, just give them the notebook, the patient runs it, and can report back to the clinician or to like the researcher who's interested without ever actually giving away access to their genome. But the second thing is that, of course, you can share raw data if you want. And the way it works in Open Humans is that you as an individual can make a decision on a per project or per research question basis of who's getting access to your data. So if you have your genetic data in Open Humans and researcher A is having a research question, you can give researcher A access to this data if you think it's a good research question, if you trust the person. And if not, you just don't, and your data is still securely stored. And so all of this, again, is done using open APIs, and everyone can build on this. And if you have a research question you want to start, you can just go ahead, build it, and go ahead. Here are a couple of the examples. And I will give a couple of more detailed examples of what people are doing. And the first is actually outside genetics. It's the type 1 diabetes community around the open artificial pancreas and the Night Scout communities, where people, especially Dana Lewis, who started the whole project, was basically hacking her continuous glucose monitor to get real-time access to the glucose data 24/7, to use this data to get a better alarm of when to use more insulin, and then went ahead, even linked it up by hacking a bit more, writing open source software and open source hardware to automatically pump insulin when needed. So the open APS community made like an open artificial pancreas, which is built around open source hardware and software, which everyone can use. And they not only collect this data individually, but they actually went ahead and put this data into Open Humans as a patient community. So each member, and they have like a couple of hundred members around the globe, they collect their continuous glucose monitor data on their phone or on the website using the tools they built themselves. They import this data into Open Humans through a web app they control themselves, and then this data is privately stored in their Open Humans account. But this, again, would be not interesting for patients, but once they actually start coming together as a community and finding each other, they can start using this data. And one thing they did is they built their own data commons. So it's a completely patient-led data commons for continuous glucose monitor data. And it's the patient community that decides which researchers get access to the data and how to use the data. Similarly, they went ahead, built their own data commons for the insulin pumping data they have as well now, so there's even more data that researchers could ask for. And of course, they start doing their own experiments because now they have a couple of hundred people who have collected the same kind of data. One example what they are doing right now is they do their own low-carbohydrate diet experiments to see how it influenced their glucose levels and how much insulin they need, because it's interesting to them and researchers were not interested in doing it, so they made their own research question, start collecting the data themselves, do their own intervention, and they do like basically a whole research project all by themselves. And again, as the data is stored in Open Humans, if you have another idea of what you want to do, you can make your project, ask people to give access to the data, and go ahead. Another patient community, again, not genetic one, is the cluster headache community, and this one is based around patients largely in the Netherlands. And here again, cluster headaches are worse than migraines, so people are really struck down partially for days, weeks, and maybe even months at a time where they can't do anything really. And they have a very strong interest in figuring out what triggers their attacks, how can they avoid them, and which medication helps them. So one patient based in the Netherlands started making his own mobile phone app for collecting these data, like the cluster headache intensity, which interventions they did, whether there were any triggers around them. And he started building this app just for himself to get this data because no one else was willing to provide this data for him. And then at some point he heard about Open Humans and decided, well, it would be nice if other patients could, who are also collecting this data locally on their phones, if we can share this data collectively and collect it together. So they linked up to Open Humans, and now there's a couple, I don't know how many people we have currently who are collecting this data, all their cluster headaches, put it into Open Humans. And the problem for them was they're actually not experts, so they're not the people who know how to analyze this data and how to actually do it. So the patient community came up their own way to dealing with this issue, and they reached out to a code academy, where you have lots of people who are learning data analysis, data visualization, and students eager to use real-world data. And this code academy, in collaboration with the patient community, now is actually going through the data sets, and individuals can say they are willing to give the code academy data access, and the students actually provide these reports and upload them back into the individual patient's Open Humans account, so they just basically magically get a report one day in their account saying, this is what we found out about your cluster headaches. And because they're interested again in sharing data, even more patients individually can even donate publicly their whole data reports so that they can do advocacy around it. So they have now a couple of, I think, 10, 20 people who have shared their whole reports about what works for them publicly to make advocacy, to learn from each other. And they even go ahead and make their own patient-led experiments. And if you look at the app screenshot here on the left, you see that one of the interventions they are trying is using magic mushrooms, because the patients are largely based in the Netherlands, where like drug legislation is a bit more liberal than in the US. They experiment around microdosing magic mushrooms with like a couple of patients who just say, we see whether this will prevent having more attacks, and they can collect the data, they will get an analysis from the Code Academy, so even if they are not the experts in going through these data, they can learn from it. And one more example that's a bit more close to genetics is how 23andMe data, for example, can be used in Open Humans. Again, if you upload it, you can use it and just look at it using these notebooks as we've seen earlier. But you can also do stuff like imputation. One community member built their own genome imputation tool based on published methods, which is in Open Humans. So even if you have only your 23andMe data, you just use this tool, log in, give data right access, and you have like a more complete genome in your Open Humans data. And then you can share it with different research studies, and one of them here is the genetics of personality type, which is done by an independent researcher. She is based at like an independent institution. She has no real background in genomics, but was like, I'm interested in this, I have no money for doing sequencing, so maybe these people are willing to give data access to it. So this is all really fun and interesting, but I think like I've seen some people being a bit like, so personality of genetics, genetics of personality, that's weird, and that's like one place where the governance comes in. So how can we build trust and community around this data and make sure that the data is used in a responsible way? And the first thing we do is if you want to do a project on Open Humans, you can't just go ahead and ask everyone to donate data to you. You need to get approval by the community itself. It's not me or any one of the people running Open Humans who decides which projects are being run. It's made in a public way. People need to ask for permission of the community to run their project. And the genetics of personality type one is here. People say that even if IRB approval, they give like the whole documentation, put it publicly to all the other community members in a forum, say what they want to do. And in this case, the genetics of personality type you might find even more weird, because instead of going for the big five for anything, they go for the Myers-Briggs type indicator. which people have like good reasons to believe is not super useful, but this individual researcher thought it might be interesting. And then actually a discussion ensues on the forum. So the first person says, well, they have IRB approval, nothing raises any flags for me personally, and I even made some like recommendations on a technical level how to make their website better. But the next person goes ahead and is like, well, are you kidding me? This is basically pseudoscience. Should we even allow this being run on the platform? And then this discussion went on and on for a couple of days, and I think even weeks of people going back and forth, and the researcher trying to explain why she thinks it's like a good project to be run. And in the end, I think the consensus was that Open Humans as a community should not try to police the things we think are pseudoscience. It's like, this will not be harmful to anyone. People will not find out anything because the Myers-Briggs type indicator doesn't work in the first place. So they will get a null result, no harm done, except people filling out the survey. So the community decided to approve this and go ahead. And the second way that we try to get trust in building community is that actually the nonprofit that runs Open Humans, the Open Humans Foundation, is open in who can actually join the board. So once a year we have like the board elections, and it's not that the board re-elects itself or from like the board elects, but it's the community. So if you've signed up for Open Humans at any point in the past, you will get an email saying the board elections are coming up. First of all, would you like to run for the board? So put your name in the hat if you want to be somehow responsible for governing the community. And then afterwards, the community actually starts to vote on it. And like the people on the board, at least to 1/3 right now, are being elected by the community itself to have actually input into the whole governance of the larger foundation even. So I think that's, the too long didn't read is, first of all, we allow participants to import their data and make per project decisions on how to share this data. The data using projects can be both academic or patient-led even, which is really interesting for many patient groups which feel they're underrepresented otherwise. And participants are playing an active role in the governance of the ecosystem at large and are not just there for giving data away. And that's it from me. Thanks.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the floor? And so I would encourage you, I will generally, if there is a choice between choosing a woman and a man to speak first, I will choose the woman because statistically that gets more women speaking. So Shubha, would you like to speak in front of Misha?
Hi, I'm Shubha Chandrasekharan from All of Us Research Program. I found that fascinating. So for the genetics of personality case where you have the community discussing whether they should approve this or not, I'd love to hear what was the process in the end. Is it hands up, hands down voting? How were they assessing benefits and harms, not just to themselves, but to the broader community or society of this type of research?
So for now, the process is that in the end, there's a consensus in the community of all the members who participate. So actually the community discussion goes on until either there's a consensus to not approve it or to approve it. And usually so far we've ended up on approval every single time, but often after like the projects were heavily modified, because the people who want to run the project are participating in the discussion as well. They can actually take the feedback from the community and change their research question, their framework for doing their research and so on to make the project better for all the people who want to participate. And so far we have no clear guidelines of like, for example, larger societal impacts. We have like project guidelines which we give participants to say, this is how projects should look like and this is what you should keep in mind. But I think there's no specific point in the guidelines right now for the larger societal impact.
Thanks. That was wonderful, though I'm biased. I'm interested in your response to Tony Pollan's question from the last session. What, if anything, does a project like Open Humans or OpenSNP do when the SNP data or whatever are garbage? Is that something the community fixes?
So the easy answer at this point is we don't do anything about it. We just hope that people do upload just the files they get without making any changes. And if like the input data is garbage, then there's not much we can do to find it out. I mean, people could make their own projects to check for the data quality, because you could, like, the same way that someone made a data imputation tool, you could make like a data quality check tool to figure out which of the data is useful or not, or flag it. But it's hard for us at this point to figure out which data is valuable or not, because there's not many ways to figure it out in many cases.
Thank you. You mentioned that the data are securely stored. What does securely stored mean more specifically? And what would the response of Open Humans be to a request for that data from a law enforcement entity?
So we are storing the data, like on a technical level, it's stored encrypted in Amazon S3, but we are completely following the GDPR guidelines to also allow for European users. So we are doing like all of the, like deleting the data, yada, yada. At the same time, of course, given that the Open Humans Foundation is based in the US, if like US law enforcement comes and forces us to hand over the data, there I think is not much we can do except for accidentally losing the S3 keys.
Okay. Thank you, and let's give Bastian a hand again, please. Next up, we have Dawn Berry. And while Dawn's getting ready, let's say thank you, Adam, who has to leave and go do a different presentation.
All right. Good morning, everyone. It's a real honor to be here today. You know, the guidance we were given in going to this panel was think really big picture, the what and the why you're doing. And I love that we're really centralizing on people first. But it's not just people first. It's people included through the whole system and its benefit to people. So I'm delighted to be here with you today to talk about what we're doing at Luna. So I've been in genomics my whole career. Prior to starting Luna, I was at Illumina for 12 years as the VP of Applied Genomics. So I am a genomics junkie. I have great respect and admiration for this wonderful molecule. And even in a group like this, I like to reiterate that this is a very powerful multimodal molecule as we're thinking about control. So it is at our identifier. We like to operate in a world where re-identification is a reality. I think that makes us future-proof. It's also our blueprint. We know a lot about disease predisposition, carrier status, traits, and ancestry. But as Bastian alluded to, in the future, perhaps we'll know more about behaviors, right? Aggression, intelligence, neuroticism, et cetera. And so when we think about control of this information, it is very contextual. And finally, it's not just our property. It is our family's property. So control in that context we all must really, really consider that. So the opportunity is upon us with so much data to really think about reshaping research and driving discovery. But at the same time, we are living in a world where we have a little bit of corporate overconfidence in terms of our data security and therefore privacy. But if we're going to get to this future that I believe you all believe in, and I certainly believe in, our genome as a resource that we use throughout our life as we go through different lifetimes, from planning a baby to making sure the baby has a good start, all the way to encountering disease and understanding our medications, we need to really dial up research so that we can make genomic information more robust, more actionable, and certainly more preventative. And to do that, I believe we've got to bring all this data together. We've been in probably the last 10 years obsessed with DNA data, but we all know all along that it's not just DNA. It's our lifestyle, environment, nutrition, social and structural determinants. And now, in this age, with people having more access to their data, generating more data, thanks to HIPAA, meaningful use, privacy, patient portals, and privacy acts, we can start breaking down these data silos by recognizing individuals as the owners of the data and recognizing their rights to share that data for the greater good of discovery and beyond. So they have that access, they have that permission now. And so with this history and hindsight, a bunch of us got together. So we are a public benefit corporation called Luna PBC. We are a bunch of former Illumina executives and professionals in economics and consumers, and we are really obsessed with reshaping the research paradigm by promoting people from subjects of research to partners in discovery. So we're about 25 people located in San Diego. I was asked to be clear about what a public benefit corporation is. So this is a corporate structure that recognizes right out the gate the power of shareholders and stakeholders. Social responsibility and social impact is in your charter, and you have the ability to protect yourself against investor interest when you prioritize the charter over profits. And so in our charter is use of data for advancements in health and quality of life that constrains the use of data. So we believe this architecture represents a durable infrastructure, but also one that can have very good social impact. So some companies that are also B Corps are Warby Parker, Ben & Jerry's, Patagonia. There are very good companies doing good things under an architecture like this. So your beliefs guide how you make actions in your companies. And we've done a lot of looking at the past, being motivated by the past, listening to the present. And this was a project that we were involved in, a lot of us at Illumina at Baylor. The question being, how do you create a medical information commons? And it was really out in the street asking people what's going to preventing them from sharing their data for research. And we learned a lot, obviously, in this. And so people, of course, have concerns over data privacy and security, but they have hope. And we see that in DTC with a lot of people sharing their data for research. But they need control. They desire control. This is prohibiting them from joining a lot of these efforts. And they also prefer that any benefits are shared back with them. So we believe and are operationalizing these principles. We also believe that people first and foremost, is the right thing to do. But there are also benefits, as we're all here, to advance research and quality of life for all. So when you put people in control versus institutions, you break these institutional and geographic data silos, these institutional data sovereignties. When you make the relationship with the individual, the data sharer, when they are invited and feeling in control and having transparency, we have a chance to get to the real world and social determinants data that we believe people are the best curators of their environment and their health profile, and they can share that. We're also seeing now, when you give people control and transparency, that we're seeing more understudied populations coming into the equation. I like to say that there's an earned distrust with a lot of understudied populations from the past, and we've got to do better going forward. And finally, we love GDPR. We think people first is the right thing to do, so we're honoring privacy laws and these evolving trends in individual data control so that we invite people into a responsible relationship. So we thought to ourselves in building this company, what do we really want to do? What if instead of treating people and patients as the least important in the clinical trial or research equation, what if we treated them as the most important, the best curators of their health profile? What if instead of institutions owning and controlling data, we gave all the control to the individuals themselves? What if instead of institutions taking individuals' data, trading it, buying it, selling it, what if we created a platform for sharing? And I intentionally use the word sharing. When you share something, you keep it. You can unshare it. You can unpermission it. When you sell something or when you give it away, you are relinquishing ownership and control of that asset. And your data is an asset, and I always encourage sharing it and not giving it away. And what if we created a platform that's built with purpose, that is a community, that's built for research without research kind of being a byproduct, a silent byproduct of a lot of the products that we use and buy. So with this inspiration, I guess, we formed Luna DNA. Luna DNA is a health data sharing platform that, as I said, promotes individuals from subjects to partners in research. Luna hosts people-permissioned data that's linked to a discovery sandbox. Research questions enter the sandbox and only answers leave. And and value is shared with the members, which I'll share with you. So a good analogy, not many people like it, but it's like a health data co-op, recognizing when we all come together, the collective has more value than the sum of its parts. So the future, I believe, is sideways and not siloed. It's connected and not dictated. It's socially responsible and transparent, and all that comes back down to trust. I mean, you just can't pay lip service to trust, can't tell people to trust you. So how are you operationalizing trust? To me, these are table stakes. How we're thinking about trust is you have to have transparency. You have to have reciprocity. You've got to give individuals the control. That means the ability to delete themselves from the system, stop sharing at any time, and frankly, you have to have the technical, contractual, and legal frameworks to reinforce this trust. It doesn't mean you'll get it, but it's table stakes, as I said. In this platform, so in thinking about what are the mechanisms that we can use to drive transparency and to drive reciprocity, we explored different avenues here, from digital currency or cryptocurrency, which we put away, to just giving rewards back. And none of them felt in the spirit of what we're trying to do, which is drive a research community to achieve the scope and scale, diversity, inclusive nature of the data. So we were inspired by a long-standing model, which was this. The thesis is if data has value, we approached the Securities and Exchange Commission and said, if data has value, we want to use it as currency by which to acquire shares of ownership in the company. And they qualified us. So this is the first of its kind data for shares model, what this means is when value is created in the platform, that value is shared with the shareholders, i.e. the data sharers, in the form of dividends. So this allows you to distribute any value to the platform to the people who have contributed the data. This is also a mechanism for transparency. So the SEC oversees this platform and protects the institutional investor. So you can't change your mind down the road what you're doing with the data, or like I've learned in business school, build your company so somebody else is going to run it in the future and they may not have the same values. This is inked. These are investments by people. And so we're very proud of this infrastructure. Sorry, this got wonky here. But it respects that, the people in the platform, they get something. They get an ownership asset, they get control, and they have a pride and purpose of being associated with research. Discovery communities, who I'll talk about in a bit, have a place at the seat at the discovery table. They have data stewardship, and people can donate any dividends back to those communities. And finally, researchers can start seeing perhaps recruitment and retention, enrichment of data, and do research in a GDPR compliant way where they can just assume the role of the data processor. This was just published in Nature Biotech. If you want to check it out, it was published on September 19th. We're very big on transparency, and outlined in this paper is all the challenges and opportunities with running a model in this way, overseen by the SEC. I think platforms have to be super clear and easy and secure. So just some of the principles driving us, we have two-factor authentication up front. It creates friction. It creates a couple more steps. But this is the way to be secure. And so you have to take into consideration membership, but also the friction to have the security. This is a 4-page consent. We're built for research, so there's not a whole bunch of other disclaimers. And it's easy to read. And finally, you can link up and share your DNA data that you've gotten from a lab or 23andMe, or your health records. We've partnered with Medfusion in that capacity, as well as surveys, custom surveys, off-the-shelf surveys. And we're very proud to be partnering with disease communities first and foremost. We believe there's a high unmet need and a very strong discovery potential to give patients a seat at the table. And so one of our early partnerships sorry, this got all goofy here too, but with Genetic Alliance, who for many years has had the platform for engaging everyone responsibly, where disease registries can form, start collecting data, get IRB approval, and now kind of bolted onto Luna, have data stewardship for omics, surveys, EHRs, et cetera, and have a place for responsible research where the data doesn't have to be downloaded and uploaded somewhere else. So in closing, just some thoughts for the panel. These are the principles we live by and that we're running the platform. So there's a broad consent for use of data de-identified in aggregate, with opt-in consent for anything that requires an individual to opt in a specific study, or if a researcher wants additional information, they and only them have the ability to break their anonymity in the system. We believe benefits should be shared. Data has value. There's a lot of companies making a lot of value from our data, from the use of products. And finally, anonymity, while having that continuous connection, is an asset in the system. Again, we don't want you lose control. If we're going to give people control, their data has to stay in the system. A single copy is in the system, and they control its inclusion. So having research happening in the system is our driving principle. And finally, we just have to remember that when we talk about engaging with DNA information, to get that scope and scale and diversity, we have to really honor that we're still figuring this space out, and even the definitions that we're using here. And I will stop there. Oh, sorry, that was supposed to be thank you, so I'll just leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dawn. So again, I'd like to invite any questions from the floor or from the internet.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm quite curious to know how much value do you actually get in terms of putting your data up?
Yeah, so it's the difference between sharing in the dividends versus monetary. So this is not a transaction where you share data and we give you something back. It goes into a broader collective. This is all laid out in the SEC. And we don't know what the future value of the asset will be, the collective community asset. And that's, the next question is usually inducement. We don't know what the future value is, but it's not life-changing money, right? We're just talking about sharing in the value created, being transparent, and allowing people to push that value back. And then also recognizing on the inducement question, or once you ask that, it's usually the next question, is you can change your mind and delete yourself at any time. But, modeling suggests $70, $50, something like that on an annual. But it's hard to predict. So use the analogy of a new company you invest in, how much you're going to make later. We don't know.
Thanks.
Yep.
So it's an impressive platform,
Thank you.
So congratulations on what you've done. One thing I'm interested in is federation. That is, all this data is not going to be sitting inside of your stuff. There might be sitting in some other platforms as well. Have you given any thought to federating things so that a model can be passed between these different silos?
Absolutely. And I think about silos not as a structural entity. Everything is in the cloud. We are working currently on AWS HIPAA-compliant clouds, and the ability to bring in private data or connect to other data sets and do that experiment virtually when data is living in different places is absolutely contemplated. We don't want silos. That's not what we're about.
Yeah. One more if it's very quick.
Very quick. So just in terms of research reproducibility, maybe I'm not understanding quite clearly, but if patients can sort of take themselves in and out of this resource at will, if you do some research and you find some cool things, how's someone else going to reproduce that? Or traditionally with papers, like do you know what I'm saying?
Okay, let's get a response, because I want to make sure we get your question.
Go ahead and respond.
Yeah, we've got freezing the results in the data set, but doing the next experiment, if someone has deleted themselves, will be a challenge. But this is when people have control of their data and they say they want to get out of the system, that is a risk in reproducibility.
So my question is around harmonizing data from different platforms. Are there any restrictions as to what platforms, what data from which platforms you accept, and how do you harmonize across different platforms?
It depends on which data type we're talking about. So, DNA data has a different harmonization strategy than electronic health records. So, for example, electronic health records, we're working with a partner, MedFusion, that standardizes to FHIR and HL7 formats. Genomic data, standardizing to GVCF format. So it kind of depends on what data type we're talking about. Where it starts to get challenging, I'm not sure anybody's figured it out yet, is we're talking about wearables and sensors and even surveys. But the ability to triangulate some of that data and have higher quality through that triangulation is what we're thinking about. But it depends on the data type.
Thank you, Don. Let's give another hand. It's always awkward to be a moderator and then get up and talk at the end. So I want to draw on a lot of what we just heard and think about the ways that the concept of open data has actually made personal control over genomic data for research harder rather than easier. Because the sort of binary concept of open versus closed puts us in conflict with a lot of research regulation and data protection regulation. And what we've heard so far is a lot of different ways that address that. So I work at Sage Bionetworks. We're a nonprofit research institute. Our goal is increasing the reliability of claims that are published in scientific papers through open science methods. We have statistical ways to deal with the propagation of uncertainty, but they stop once you get claims in papers. And we don't think about the propagation of uncertainty once you're taking 25 papers and trying to combine them to do translation. So that's where we try to work. And people like to ask me, what's the governance thing that I need to do to be successful? And don't I just need to make my data open? And the answer is often no. That there's this binary, is it open, that comes from open data outside of the life sciences, comes from open source software, from free culture, where I've spent a lot of my career. But that's not what we need here. We have a spectrum of technical opportunities and governance opportunities, not a binary, is it open or is it closed, that can help us get where we want to go. Because it is very hard to make something open and control it, especially in the United States. So this is where I started in this. 5 years ago, I made this screen for Apple. when we were working on research kit consent. And we picked a fight with Apple during that process where we said you have to give people the right to download their data, and you have to give them the right to share their data beyond the study. So this was an option we made available. There was actually a very funny phone call where I had to give a prediction of how many people would choose to share their data broadly as opposed to sharing it just with the study coordinators. I made up the number of 75% on the spot. It turned out to be about 68%, so I got lucky. And this forced us to figure out what does it mean to share my data with qualified researchers worldwide, because we had not actually developed any of the governance behind this question when we made it available to participants. This is what we had to work with. On the governance side, we could create tiers of data, right, from open to data passports to call us and beg. We could use contracts. Contracts are very weak. Right? They don't work outside the country in which they were signed for the most part. This is a truth of smart contracts as well. You cannot surpass the legal regimes of the country you do contract in. Codes of conduct are actually pretty powerful, so that's in the toolkit. This idea that if a researcher goes through some process, we can give them a passport in the same way that passports allow us to transit borders with lower transaction costs than not having passports. We could make the researcher give us a statement. We can audit. This is actually really important. Surveilling the data user is an incredibly underrated part of the toolkit. And then, of course, sanctions, which for the most part involves naming and shaming, because there's not a lot of criminal stuff that you can do here. And again, contract disputes are pretty weak compared to copyright licenses and other kinds of open source tools. But then on the tech side, we just heard Don mention a data enclave where the data don't leave. That's a really important thing to think about. It's not just that the cloud makes it easy to transfer data, it makes it easy to protect data. But then it's not open. Right? The user going to the data or the model going to the data is incredibly powerful. Right? Only allowing certain classes of queries on certain data sets is very powerful to respect certain communities' desires for control, particularly indigenous communities that would like to avoid group harms. Right? Encryption and cloaking are very important, and then containers. And Bastien alluded to notebooks, and when we think about the ability to start to contain data in a queryable system that doesn't require the things to be actually exposed is very important, as is the ability to write notebooks that encapsulate the kinds of questions researchers or patients might want to ask. This is all taking us towards a world that looks more like the old web, where even philosophy majors like me could write HTML. And that's what we need to get towards if there's actually going to be meaningful patient empowerment here. But we have to think about these things together, not apart. And this is nowhere near as simple as, is it open? So what we created for this qualified researcher process was a data release system that imposes burdens on researchers. So the idea is that the people who participated, this is simple data, surveys and sensors, no genomes, no health records. If it didn't work here, it wouldn't work anywhere, was the thesis. And it was low risk enough that we felt comfortable to take the risk and offer the risk to the participants. But the idea was try to make it something close to equipoise for the researcher, where they were at least as much at risk as the data participant. So the transactional cost, right, you have to register for an account and take a quiz. Each researcher actually has to do these things themselves. You would not believe how difficult this is for some elite scientists. These are questions, these are things we actually have to say on a regular basis. And I apologize for the weird format. Every time I do PowerPoint on Windows, I cry for EHR interoperability because this is simple. My favorite question is, don't you think this is unfair? And we just say, no, we don't think this is unfair. This is the kind of test that people have to pass. We learned in our work on informed consent that no one reads the document. And so you have to come up with interactions. Don mentioned the word friction. It's one of my favorite words. Friction on purpose is our friend. Right? It cuts against this whole ethos of frictionless design that is driven at Silicon Valley, but friction is your friend. This is a test. Everyone says, but I could look up the answers in the guide. We're like, right. Then you actually read those sentences. These are the sentences that are really important to have read. Right? And it deals with this fact that we have a culture of clicking OK on complicated legal documents that are between us and our goal. Now, we might not have a legal obligation as we do an informed consent to do this, but it is as important if we're going to create systems that my control over data is to give it to a researcher. We have an obligation to try to make the researcher understand the deal, just like we do to make sure the patient understands the deal. Researchers don't have to pay attention to anything when they access data. They write form letters. Friction is the friend here. Exposure. If you share your data, you are exposed to those who do the work. So we require symmetric exposure, right? You need the real name of the researcher. They don't get to be anonymous or pseudonymous. Affiliation and location and a public profile. One piece at least of information about you has to be on the ORCID profile. This is not perfect, right? A sociopath can quite easily defeat this, but the reality is most trolls and bullies are unwilling to troll and bully in places where they have to do stuff other than troll and bully. And so you put these transaction costs as extra friction in front of the researcher, you can filter to a certain extent. Somebody has to vouch for you in writing. So if you're a traditional researcher, that's your signing official. It's quite easy. If you're not a traditional researcher, you need to go get a notary. This is not that hard. I have 5 notaries in my neighborhood. We chose notaries specifically because they're often available in communities that are underrepresented in research, at the corner store. And then you have to physically download, print, sign, scan, and upload an oath. Right? This is the oath. Again, we don't expect that anyone would have read this if we wrote it out. And from real estate, we know that making you put your initials next to a thing makes you look at the thing. Right? And this all comes from a field of research called eye gaze tracking. This is how we look at web pages. We do not read the words. We scan in a pattern that looks like an F, if we're doing sort of English left to right reading. Interestingly, if you look at the languages that read the other direction, you see the same pattern mirrored. So these are all different ways to make sure that the researchers understand the deal, because that's part of research, of putting control into my hands and saying I want to donate it. And then, of course, a data use statement that's publicly linked. And this is great. We get, for one of the data sets we've got, hundreds of researchers from around the world, right, everywhere, every continent except Antarctica, who are using these data. But it struck us that when we did it this way, we were centering the data set itself. Because what we did is we made the data set downloadable. That's why we had to go through all this rigmarole. And it implies that data sharing equals data copying. Right? It radically decreases the security because we have no idea if people are complying with the deal they signed up for when they've got the data set. And it encourages, in many ways, people to do their research in their own place in a way that makes it harder to do aggregation over time. So we've been working for the last several years on what would this spectrum of sharing look like. And so, generally speaking, we try to categorize this to federated research, which is really a lot of what the GA4GH is up to. Centralized research, which I think is what Luna is doing. This is in many ways what the All of Us research program that we're involved in is doing. And then sequestered research, which is, is there data that cannot be made available in a traditional form because it was not consented properly, or was never consented at all, or because it belongs to a group that has been harmed and has earned distrust, I love this phrase, in research. And there are technical approaches that make each of these not only possible, but actually kind of easy. So this is how we try to draw a map of the space. So closed and restricted is low accessibility and low degree of freedom. Closed unrestricted is actually low accessibility except for elite scientists, but quite high degrees of freedom, because I get the data, and I can do whatever I want with it locally. Right? Traditional open, right, is obviously quite accessible and quite free. Collaboration is a form of sharing that we often don't talk about that's quite powerful. I think Adam laid out some of that in his talk. And we spend most of our time at Sage looking at these two elements of what does it look like to govern a sandbox, by which we mean a place where the data live in the cloud, researchers can add their data and run queries, and sort of do that in an unsupervised manner other than whatever auditing and surveillance that you've got. They don't have to call an IRB when they change their research focus inside the cloud. That's what we mean by sandbox. And then model to data is this more restrictive form where we talk about you have a data steward that has certain rights to run certain classes of queries, and then that steward can release out to a very large group of data users the right to submit those queries. But the steward actually executes those queries, and only the answers flow back to the individual. And there's, I think, what Don laid out is something that's almost in between the two in a way that's really interesting to me. Right? These are places that go way beyond, is it open? But to begin to make data available in a way that offers the participants the choice of how they want to make their data shareable. Some people, right, Stephen was my friend, right? My own data is in the upper right-hand corner of this. Right? Stephen's was up in the upper right-hand corner of this. It's not for everybody, and if it's the choice we offer to everybody, many people will choose not to make it available at all, especially those worried about group harms that can come from the kinds of uses of these data. But if we can find ways to make sandboxes and model to data more or less standardized, right, to the extent that a federated query, to the question from the previous gentleman here, that a federated query could run across multiple sandboxes at once in a federated learning environment, we start to have a path to actually having both control and local sort of ownership and oversight, but the ability to run certain kinds of questions that cut across a network. And when it comes to something like model to data, it offers the ability to open up a lot of legacy data. One of the things that we've done here is we've taken 800,000 mammograms that were not available under any kind of legal regime to redistribute, but where there was the ability to actually run queries on them, and made them available to thousands of people by making a synthetic data set available for training, retaining those mammograms behind a firewall, and when people sent in their models, we ran those models and sent the answers back in a challenge. Right? That's data that was literally locked that became unlocked. But it can't get there if our only question is it open, is it closed? And so I'm going to leave you with this extremely exciting slide, because these are the kinds of questions that we need participants to ask, right? What's the freedom I want to make available? What's the ability to verify I want to make available? This issue of the right to be forgotten and deleting my data is very relevant in that ability to verify. What's the breadth of dissemination? What's the sustainability? When we talk about control for people, if you want control, you have responsibility. And these are some of the questions that we need to be asking patients to think about as they decide where they want to make their data available. Right? There's respect in control. And respect involves thinking through the issues of what you want your data to do as you go forward. And those of us that run platforms have done a terrible job of showing that respect and offering those choices back to patients. But this is the kind of thinking and the degree of detail that's required to offer that respect. I would be remiss if I didn't thank my incredible team at SAGE, particularly Megan Doerr, who did a lot of the design of the qualified research system that I just showed you, and the broader organization. And with that, I'll stop. This is where money comes from, and you should feel free to @ me on various platforms. Thank you. I'll take questions.
Wear my heels so I can get up here quick. Thanks, John. The last model that you showed reminds where essentially questions are brought to the data and could be done across a number of federated databases reminds me a lot of the HMO Research Network and the Sentinel system. But in building Sentinel, they had to make sure that the data in each of the federated sites was sort of enabled apples to apples comparisons. Do you think that's also going to be true in that model where you're sort of seeking to ask queries across a bunch of databases? You're not going to be able to merge those results if the data behind that isn't standardized in some way.
Yeah, that's exactly right. A lot of this requires collective behavior by research platform providers who have not shown a lot of skill in collective behavior. That's true of us as well. I'm not hitting anybody without hitting myself and my group. A lot of this theory comes from a guy at Microsoft Research named Jim Gray, who sailed out of the Bay and disappeared about 10 years ago. But he saw a world where the data would be too big or too sensitive to leave, and the models would need to visit them. And what I like about his theory is that you don't get to interoperability by saying we're going to get to interoperability, forming a working group, and overfunding it. You do by defining 5 queries that need to work. And then everyone makes those queries work, and only those. It doesn't create a freak out that says, oh my God, you're going to have access to everything. You say, no, we need these records. And then when those work, you add 5 more. And when those work, you add 5 more. And you go from working query to working query. And it is the root of how I think we get there for this. And these kinds of symposia are important because if patients require us to be interoperable, we'll eventually be interoperable because the power at the end of the day is from the people who give permission to do the research. But this is why I encourage, as you think about control, to go beyond, do I have a copy? And under what terms will you govern it? Because that is how I think, it's what's the Nancy Pelosi used this quote yesterday, with public sentiment, all is possible. Without public sentiment, nothing is possible.
And I'd like to actually hear just from everybody, what is the best model that you've seen for patient interoperability and communication? That is not just somebody calling up, trying to withdraw their DNA from a study, but actually where patients, according to the original outlines of all of this consent, are notified about what studies their DNA, their health records are involved with, where they can see those records of who it is who has my data, what products have been developed, what studies have been published, have there been any corrections to those studies?
Gosh, I am coming up short in terms of where that's happening. I'm sorry, I'm coming up short in terms of where that's happening.
Yeah, same for me.
Audience participation?
Yeah, I'd be curious if anyone has any good models on this. The one that we've been playing with is less individual and more looking at, in the Convention on Biological Diversity, there's this concept of access and benefit sharing to those indigenous groups that make traditional knowledge available, and we think a lot of what patients have is aligned with traditional knowledge. And so it's not always monetary, but it can often be access to the papers, to the products, and so forth.
I think that's a little bit where the bullishness, I think blockchain got ahead of its skis when it first came out, but I think that's where the bullishness on blockchain, that you would have a public, transparent, immutable, no central administrator, that level of ledgering would be able to happen, and I think that's why everybody got so excited about it, and probably because it hasn't happened as much as it should.
Just to say, we had a proposal into NSF to develop a blockchain true data bank where people can input, where they have interest, where they can withdraw, and where their funds, which is their personal information, are protected. And we didn't get funded, but I'm going to be on a 3 o'clock panel here. But I'd love to hear from anybody who has a good idea of how
Sure.
this has to work, and I'll be here today, and any other speakers who come up, because I do think we all are saying, oh, the patient, or the participant, but really they're not considered in the models or in the design at all. There's no consideration like there is at Apple to the consumer coming in and being able to see things. And adding that after the fact to our studies, I have found almost impossible. So it'd be nice to see some development from the programmers that considers an interface that is clear and easily accessible to my mother. Thanks.
So Dawn's going to answer, but can I ask the panelists from the previous panel to come on up while she answers?
Yeah, and I think that's great. I'm looking forward to your panel. In terms of thinking about blockchain and GDPR, the right to be forgotten, the right to delete yourself, certainly we don't want to put personal information on a blockchain, and it's not robust enough to be carrying big files around. So look forward to your talk. But I do think the transparency in data usage on top of the anonymity of the people who are participating, I think look forward to hearing how that's going to work.
Okay, so now we're almost a working group up here. I have questions written down for these people, but how often do you have these people up on stage? I significantly encourage you to get to the microphones and ask some questions. Please, go ahead.
I was curious about solutions that don't not only account for active patients and patient advocates, but also cater to more passive consumers or your average patient who's just interacting with the healthcare system.
Dawn, go ahead.
Yep.
Otherwise, I'm going to put you on the spot randomly, just so you know.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I love the earlier comment that when we talk about people don't want, like the generalization of all people, I think healthy people have so much to give to research. They're very data engaged. They have, through direct-to-consumer DNA platforms, been opting into research. So at least how we're contemplating it is we welcome healthy people to come in and grab their EHR and upload their DNA data, as well as patients and registries and foundations and other programs that we'll be rolling out soon. But I think we need to think about health not as a status. I'm neither not healthy or healthy, but rather life as a continuum. And if we can start tracking healthy people with longitudinal continuous data, when they get sick, statistically, a lot of us will get sick, to be able to look back in time and not do just retrospective snapshot in time what broke, but what was breaking, what was happening. And I think the biggest opportunity is to bring healthy people into the research equation.
I'd just like to echo that and think of all the lessons learned from like the nurses study and other initiatives that track people, healthy people. What? I don't know how much I can unpack it, maybe like a carry-on. So if somebody else understands the details of the nurses study better than me, please chime in. But from what I understand, this is a very large initiative called the Framingham study. And it was, in essence, a way to follow a group of people, nurses, that happened to be healthy at the time of enrollment, or just at whatever stage they were in their health at the time of enrollment, but then they were followed longitudinally for a long time. How long? Decades. And their blood was banked, and surveys were developed, tools were developed and deployed throughout that population, and many studies have been able to come out as a result.
So I wanted to invite Misha to help Corey solve her problem of getting access to data when it's still in the research phase. And I wonder if you could identify, because I know you were part of a team that implemented a kind of a full partnership model at Duke, and I wanted you to identify the obstacles that got in your way that were most important and how you got around those obstacles to incorporate the patients into full partnership.
Well, so greetings from the trough of disillusionment. We tried very hard. This is, beginning in 2011, prior to the HIPAA CLIA revisions. I work at Duke. Duke is a HIPAA-covered entity. And we had a very, very long tete-a-tete with the IRB, upon which I served at the time. It was very frustrating, and it was part of the impetus for us making this film, was to sort of capture these stories and these real life struggles. There are sort of unmet expectations and disappointments that abounded. Obviously the families, there's therapeutic misconception. They think that the PhD geneticists are clinicians, and that's not their fault. That's our fault. Research sequencing, especially at that time, took forever. And that was really hard. And in a couple of cases, we actually wound up subsidizing clinical exomes. But we would have participant gatherings every year. But, of course, from the family's perspective, and I'm sure many people in this room know exactly what I'm talking about, is particularly when you have a heterogeneous group where you have all kinds of phenotypes, the momentum, the activation energy that you need to get people together and, kind of unite behind pushing this rock up the hill is hard because everybody has a bit of a different rock. And they all have these enormous care burdens that they're dealing with at home. And I'll just shut up after one particular moment of clarity where I started going to, they're not called advocate, I think they're patient liaisons at Duke. I started going to their meetings, and the sort of most well-attended, vigorously participated in meeting was about parking. And I just thought, I have no idea what's important to any particular population. So we tried, and we learned empirically how hard this is.
We're going to go. So Dawn's going to comment, then we'll go with you, and then we'll go back and forth. Okay.
A couple more comments on patients as partners in research. I mean, we just asked this question. What do people need to feel engaged, to feel important, to feel like they have a seat at the table? And it were simple things like, return my data. Like, I'm a patient. I'm struggling through a healthcare condition. Give me the opportunity to take that data somewhere. That was a very valuable asset. Share progress. Offer support systems in the platform. So even if it's just access to genetic counseling, a free 1-hour discussion, that type of thing. Connect not just for this study, but for later studies. So the recognition that the continuous nature, we want to have patient-reported outcomes. We may want to do this study 2 and 3 and 4 years. So let's stay connected, and just do what you say you're going to do with the data, and that's it, nothing else.
I have a question for those of you with platforms that comes from the patient side. There are patient groups such as Corey's angiosarcoma group, the BRCA group, others with genomic conditions, where they have patient groups and they want to track what's happening in that group, but they also want to be part of a study. If their members donate that information to your platform, is the group able to access identified data so that they don't have to keep 2 databases on their members?
So in the studies that we're doing, this is not like a group consenting to the study. It's an individual providing consent to donate their tissue and data to the platform that gets released in aggregate, but there's no return of results. So it would be, we can't release, individual level data to an individual. We can't release it to the entire group.
We have to have a connecting system. So our platform, we don't know who's in the platform. It's #ABCDFG. But for the population health programs or the other discoveries, there does have to be a connection back to who that individual is, because you have a registry who's managing a lot of things that requires that person's identity.
So I'm the wrong person to answer this question, but Adam's not in the room. Cavatica has an e-honest broker system that does allow for some patient re-identification. But I don't know how much the patient can access at this point in time. The end result is that they want patients to be able to track their own data alongside this other de-identified data, but I couldn't answer specifically what it's able to do at this moment in time.
I'm thinking of a little bigger picture, not that the individual patients can re-identify data, but for instance, in our case with ROS1 positive patients, we are very rare, we're global, and people don't find each other very easily. So we would like to be able to have our patients donate data so that we can study treatments and sequencing, et cetera, and have researchers access it, so it has to be de-identified. But as a group, we also want to track where our patients are and what their conditions are and treatments so we can connect people to each other. Mm-hmm. And it's a pain in the butt to have 2 databases.
Right. No, I completely agree. And it's just a duplication of effort. So there's definitely a movement toward that group as well, not your specific group, but groups in general. And I think there's been some work around that with chordoma, which is also a fairly rare condition. So again, I am not the right person. I really wish Adam was in here, but that's a space that we should definitely explore, because you're definitely not alone in that concern. I think patients find their own little groups, and they want to know how other people in that group are doing.
So plus one on chordoma, I would urge you to reach out to Josh Summer or anyone at the Chordoma Foundation, because they really have grown this organically and I think figured out a lot of this.
Yeah, for us on Open Humans, if members join a particular community, like members join anonymously, they get a random identifier, but you can always anonymously also interact with those people. So you can message them and you can ask them to provide, for example, demographic data that you're interested in and collect this data as well. So that's definitely possible to some extent on our end.
There's an online question for the panelists with data sharing platforms. And the question is, how many participants are in each of your platforms? And once someone shares their data on your platform, do you have an opt-in or opt-out model?
For all the CountMan studies, we have close to 8,000 participants, and we have the ability for people to opt in and opt out of certain elements during the consent process. But once we've generated data and it gets deposited into the public domain, for example, on CBio portal, it's difficult. We would not have any way of taking that back, because people, like John had alluded to, can download that data. So we could take it off the platform, but it doesn't mean that we can take it out of the computers of people who have downloaded it. What we do have is the ability to stop any future, dealings with that patient's data, so we would not follow up with additional data for that patient. We would basically exit them from the study.
Through our partnerships, we're integrating over 50,000 members at this time. We're still early. We just opened the platform in December. I just want to call out what membership can be a bit of a vanity metric. What you really want is engagement with people. So if they're not opening your emails, if they're not providing data types, it really doesn't matter what your membership numbers are. So engagement is really, really what's important. Who's there to drive the mission with you? And once you pass through the consent, it's opt-in if you want to be contacted for studies. It's opt-in if a researcher wants you to break your anonymity. So we believe in opt-in as the best purveyor of individual's choice.
For us, it's around 8,000 members right now, and not all of them have uploaded any data, but the total number of data sets across all these different data sources, like 22,000 or so, and it's all opt-in. So every data used, the individual opts into this particular research project.
All right, thank you. I'm more interested in what have you seen as the key driver for patients to really share their data? And the ones that are monetizing that platform, how do you prevent data poisoning from that aspect?
Okay, so we have some folks who haven't spoken yet. Bill, do you want to jump in with motivations?
Yeah. Key driver for patients in my group is to not die. So it turns out they're looking for hope pretty much from any corner that they can go on and get it. And this is a chip that they can go on and use to barter to get some research done and to go on and meet the needs of the researchers as well.
I would say that the key driver in our studies is one of altruism. And I would also say that we've had a lot of surprises along the way in terms of engagement. Whenever we do any kind of twist or turn in any of the projects, we always work through those twists and turns with patients. And one of them was when we were getting ready to do the first data release with metastatic breast cancer data. We did 40 walkthroughs of the data with metastatic breast cancer patients that were part of the project, just to see, is there a way that we could make it more accessible? Are there ways we could describe it, this and that? We had our own hypotheses about what they would want to see and how they would want to use the data. And man, were we wrong. The theme that came out the most through those walkthroughs that still is just touching to me to this day was when this woman, Beth, had just popped up. We popped the data up, gave her control over our mouse, and she just looked through and clicked through every data element that was there, and she just said, "Oh my God, I'm not alone. You know, look at all of these people that want to save my life and that they want to save my kids' lives." And I would say that, you know, obviously we don't want to die. Obviously, that's the number one motivator. We do not want to die, but we also want to make sure that other people don't die down the road.
Corey, actually occurred to me beyond my initial flip response. There's probably a couple data points that might be useful. I wound up doing this analysis, and I wound up going to a cancer group, and I said, "Hey guys, I wound up doing this analysis. Would you be interested in this too?" And there was a woman there, Madge, says, "Oh no." I said, "Well, why not?" "Well, I'd give up all hope. I mean, it doesn't sound like you wound up getting an answer from this. It was just a waste of time. Why would I do it?" Then I talked to another guy, and another thing too. I said, I did this. And this guy was, I used to work in the oil fields. And I have a relatively brusque approach, and I wound up meeting another guy who also worked in the oil fields. And it turns out he had exactly the same disease as me. And I said, "Well, would you like to work in this thing too?" He says, "Well, I don't really see why I'd bother. I mean, it might let me talk to my researcher in a little bit more detail about what my options are, but it isn't going to go on and solve my problem." So the problem I have to go on and deal with now, in fact, is what do I go on and tell patients to convince them to get involved in this kind of a thing? And here's some of the stuff I've got so far. One is, in fact, is that, well, do you have kids? If it turns out we go on and have some genetic information from you, are you interested in exactly it impacting them? And they usually say, yeah. Second thing I bring up is this point about my aortic acacia. I said, look, these guys go on and have all this data on you. They don't necessarily look at it. And I went on and found out that I've got a heart condition now, and I need to go on and start paying attention to it. If you wind up having a lot of people looking at your medical records, you can go on and deal with this thing called WNL. It says with normal limits inside the chart, but it really means we never looked. Okay, so as a result, I was able to go on and find out, in essence, when my aorta started to open up, and from that I can go on and do some projections going forward. So in line, again, of going on and getting guys to get involved with it, one thing that I have to work with and struggle with, and I'd appreciate input from you guys, is to why should they bother? I mean, that's the words that they go on and give me. Thanks.
Same motivation. Help themselves get through their disease, help the next patient avoid the disease. And I'll just add, I'm on the board of the Alzheimer's Association. I've been fortunate to not be ill, but I have been a caregiver for two parents who were sick at the same time. And so proxy settings in the systems to have the caregivers help with their participation, for the patient's participation in research, is really important.
So we don't do a lot of the sort of direct donation. We mainly run studies, right, study-based. But what we subscribe to the idea that people engage in things for, ontologically, there's like 4 big categories: relatedness, autonomy, mastery, purpose. Mm-hmm. And we lean on purpose a lot in science. And, Patients Like Me was a great example of how relatedness helps. I think patient support groups on Facebook, that's what they do. That's why they're engaging. And I think the spot where we're failing is to give people autonomy and mastery over their day-to-day life or their care protocol. And so if we can find processes that engage people around those things first, that donate data as an after effect to call on purpose, that's when I think we're going to actually win.
Thanks. So it sounds like a lot of the patient-centered portals are always, or platforms are always, the longest epidemiologic cohort studies we could all imagine, and ultimately we'd like to have all the exposure data. So I'm wondering if any of these platforms are making it easier to bring in things like air quality, water quality. You put in your address where you lived, it geolocates that. Is anyone reaching for some of that richness of other open data that patients could attach to their own lives, especially in cancer where environmental data and investigations have been more intractable?
It's such a great question, and it's such an important question because that type of data is not easily obtained or obtainable at all through other methods like getting a patient's medical record. These are things that you sometimes have to specifically engage a patient around and ask them. We are in the process of building out a series of follow-up survey questions that we're deploying to our patients, and we're grappling right now with what should those be. Some of the environmental factors are really interesting, but for sure we're collecting reporting things like zip code. We're seeing what we can and cannot do based on biases that are inherent with an online-driven campaign, and so we have to work around some of those things. But follow-up surveys that have to do with epidemiological questions and environmental and lifestyle factors are absolutely on the radar here.
Yeah, and for us, we are allowing people to put in whatever data they basically want to put in. So we have people who put in their GPS records, either from Google Maps or from specific applications on their smartphone. People have years worth of history of where they've actually been. So at least you know where they've been, and now you can go to some other open data repositories to find the environmental factors which were present at the time. So we are definitely interested in getting the whole picture of data that we can get.
Yep, same here, planned but not integrated yet. And quality control of that data will be super important for robustness in research.
I think we have a tendency to focus our attention on the genetics, and actually genetics is just one part of the whole answer. And we are focused on genetics because it's actually the easy bit. The difficult bit is to actually capture all this richness, this variety, this amount of phenotype, environmental conditions. And actually, even if you have the capability to add that data into the whole picture, I think the other important factors is how to standardize that information so that the data that you have from different patients, from different environmental conditions is comparable. And therefore, you can perform exhaustive and rigorous analysis with that data.
So I'd just like to add that I think patients are, by and large, interested in an entirely different group of data than researchers are, and that environmental data is far more important in that group. There are some patient-led efforts that are really looking at how to collect that data, but it's challenging, right? Because there's just a lot of variance when you start dealing with that. What comes to mind is an application that was written with a patient driving that. It's called Our Brain Bank, and they're tracking daily symptoms of people with brain tumors. And that's only still capturing, I think, part of what they want to capture. And that's something that we're grappling with, too, on the brain tumor side of things, is just what are those things that are most important to patients, because they're definitely not the same thing that are most important to researchers. And how do we bring that data into a research environment with standards that will make it actually powerful? And I haven't seen anybody that's got a total solution for that, but I think that by and large, everyone that's dealing with big data is trying to address that issue. And I've been impressed anyway with the efforts to try to engage patients around what they're concerned with and help integrate that data.
I actually have a comment. And that is, I wound up talking with a guy the other day, as I went on and mentioned. He said, I had urothelial cancer. I thought, well, that's interesting. So, this is a kidney cancer thing. He says, well, after that, I wound up going on and getting pancreatic cancer. Oh, okay. And now I've got kidney cancer. I said, great. Anything else? He says, yeah, I got brain cancer too. Jesus, what kind of a job did you have? He says, I worked in the oil rigs. It turns out it's just like me. It turns out if you look at the data, you'll see that the biggest incidence of kidney cancer are in Texas, Oklahoma, and South Dakota. Those are all the spots, in fact, where primary oil production is done. Now, having been raised in Houston, I know that. But how in the world are you going to go out and have a standardized form going out and finding that kind of stuff out? One of the points, I'll bring up a point then from a woman named Elizabeth Kerr at Stanford who holds patient seminars there, and everybody gets around a table. She says the thing that the doctors like the most is sitting down with the patients and actually talking to them. They said, boy, I found out so much stuff. So in fact, instead of a data table where you go on and query on some kind of an environmental factor, if you get a square table and just bring all the patients around there and talk to them about exactly what their experiences are, you find stuff out. I can't help but think that a lot of the data that needs to be gathered right now can't be structured yet. It's all going to arise first off out of unstructured observations and then figuring out what the forms are. If you put the forms in too early, you're not going to go on and discover stuff like that, in my experience.
And That's actually a great point. I will point out that one of the other things that's hard about doing, to the extent that stuff can be structured, is it's expensive to go and get all of those data sets and make them available. And so I would encourage you to free ride on the NIH. The NIH is doing this in the All of Us research program. I have a conflict of interest. We're a sub-awardee of the Participant Technology Center. But the consent and the protocol both call for extensive data linkage. So this is into census, Social Security, death records, social determinants, environmental data will all be gathered and made available there in a way that you can bring in your data and do those kinds of queries. I actually, to Bill's point, I'm not sure that helps individuals nearly as much as qualitative conversation. But at least at the more aggregate level, for the first time, you're going to be able to query lots of data sets that only like a really richly funded lab would have been able to survive collecting, collating, and making available. And so, as these things become more and more useful, the NIH will probably have funded them to be available to you. And the whole point of All of Us is patients can come in and be researchers, right? These don't be afraid to use the government's work. I know it's kind of preaching to the choir, but it's easy to forget. Let's see, you're next.
Can I actually just add one more quick thing to that? Just very briefly, we in all of our intake surveys, we have a very open-ended question. We say, please tell us anything you think we should know about your experience with your disease. And we have thousands of responses for that. And there you can use kind of machine learning. This is where we are right now, trying to use machine learning to take a look at that unstructured data and pull out any themes. And I'll just say, just in my own cancer, there are several people that said bruising, for example. Well, that's a hallmark of radiation-associated angiosarcoma of the breast. There are people that get dogs that have angiosarcoma, and they just want to tell us that, you know what I mean? And so there could be hints that patients, if you ask enough people to just, free associate with their cancer, can provide, and then you can layer on technology to try to parse stuff out.
John, mine is going to fall under the category of a preamble followed by a what do you think?
We'll allow it.
And the reason is because I would like to harness the collective brain power of the panel and also the people in the room. So my name is Jennifer Jennings. For the past 10 years, I've had the great good fortune of managing the International Cancer Genome Consortium Secretariat, which is a collection of 50 different tumor types, and it's 50,000, and making that data freely available to researchers around the world. The issue in terms of the actual resource as the data is that it was not clinically annotated. It wasn't. We just did not have the records. The manpower or that supply in 2007 when the initiative was launched. The new project that I'm working on is called Accelerating Research in Genomic Oncology, ARGO. And the criteria in order to be a member is to provide either information from a clinical trial or as a compromise an assay. That was a long preamble. My question is, after sitting in the first two sessions this morning, I'm thinking that ICGC ARGO needs to open itself up to patient participants much more broadly, not only through the membership mechanism that we currently have in place. So two things. One, I would invite all of you to join our patient engagement working group. And secondly, how can Luna, how can Open Human, how can Sage, Chordoma, how can we work together to allow those patients to come and deposit their data in this database?
So I'm going to execute privilege. So I think we should all come talk to you at the break. We have 6 minutes left, and we still have 4 people up.
Okay.
If we answer your question, I think that we will use up all that time. But I strongly encourage, when it's over, come up and stand here, and we can all talk.
Okay, sorry for such a long preamble. As you can tell, I'm not a public speaker.
No,
Thank you, goodbye.
It works out great. It works. We can use the same total amount of time. It's perfect.
Hi, Stacey Gray from City of Hope. I have a two-part question. The first part is that, I think that we've talked a lot this morning about ways in which a traditional research paradigm is being inverted by a lot of these different sort of disruptive innovations, right? So, profound patient engagement, thinking about new ways of sort of models of data aggregation and data sharing, and things like holding researchers more accountable for the way that they're using these data. So the first part of the question is, are there other significant barriers that you see that really need to be addressed and where we might need a paradigm change? And the second part of the question is specifically around whether there have been transformations in how research is funded and what the funders expect of you in return.
Great. So I'm going to let each question go, and then we'll just go all the way across, and everyone can respond to the questions that they're most interested in.
So I was just looking for some clarification. That Bill had a great phrase earlier about, this is my data, what right do you have? I'm sort of giving you the right to look at it. But so I'm an academic researcher. I'm not a lawyer. My naive impression wasn't that it was actually entirely that clear with HIPAA and GDPR that just because the patient has their data doesn't mean they have the legal right to share that. So am I just sort of misinformed, or can anybody say something on that front?
Okay, there's a comment posted online, and it reads, I have incurable cancer. I would like to share all my data, omics, reports, imaging, at least for nonprofit, but I cannot foresee how it will impact my family. Please advise.
Thank you. My question is, when we can share the data to the platforms, we are our own data manager, how we are going to control the quality of the data, and where is a part of the education to the patients, the participants, what is the data, how to share the data, how to improve your own data quality. Thank you.
We're just going to go all the way.
In terms of research funding and whether it's any patient engagement is mandated, I think not really. I feel my impression is that these days it's pretty much that there's this fig leaf of outreach and communication that you are supposed to do, but no one really cares, and no funder will not give you money, or will you give you money if you actually do a good job?
I'll take the barriers question. I think my worry about people engaging in DNA or any kind of wearables fitness is some of the pseudoscience that was brought up, this feeling like I'm not getting in return and I just paid for something. Does that have them further disengage in the healthcare system? And then bad actors around the data. We cannot get into a place where people are receding from data and not sharing it. We have a tremendous opportunity with people who have access to their data to share it for more inclusive, richer, more longitudinal research. So I worry, I want to maintain kind of the good actors and the trusted stewards of innovation and science to reign supreme.
Jennifer, I'll try to take your question. Democracy is hard, right, as we see everywhere right now. What Bastian laid out is one of the most interesting experiments in participant-led governance that I know of worldwide. It's also quite hard to harmonize. I think Amanda just said, the things that patients want from their data, the questions that they care about, are often not the questions that a molecular or genetic biologist cares about. And this ties to this time disconnect, because if my goal is finding out the specifics of a variant so I can write a paper on it, that can be quite different from how do I gain autonomy over my care protocol to cope with that variant. And so one of the hypotheses I have is what I call dual use, where you have one database and you have two governors. One is a patient group of governors and one is a research group of governors. And they have different authority to use the database for different purposes, and maybe they even have different research communities. But it's part of the mental model failure that I think we've had is that there's one copy with one governor. And part of what you get from cloud and what you've heard from everyone here today is that you can have one copy with multiple governors, multiple portals to it, as long as you have enough faith in the steward and the infrastructure and the governance that the steward has. So rather than, trying, I think it's important to do hybridization and get patients in with researchers. That is all very important. But I think that can often lead to fundamental disappointment by patients because of the incentive and the timeline misalignments that are inherent in genetic research compared to having a disease that comes from genetics. And so I would encourage you to think broadly into what can you do that allows patients literally to be governors of it without having to integrate with those researchers necessarily. We can talk later.
So I think I'll take the data quality bit. So I'm of the firm belief that data quality needs to be addressed up front. And I think that might be a little bit different than Open Humans, which seems to be a model that's working really well. So I'm open to discussion around that. But if I were a researcher, I wouldn't want to go in and have to filter through all the bad data to get to what I'm looking for. If I'm doing a research project on GBMs with a certain mutation, I want to trust that what I'm finding is indeed GBMs with that particular mutation. And so I think that a certain amount of work on the front end saves everybody a lot of time on the back end. And then when you start looking at what input may come directly from patients, right? Because it's easy to get it's not easy, but it's easier to get some scientists to agree on these data standards and say, this is, and we're going to have it reviewed twice, we're going to do whatever those things are, right? When you then throw that out to the masses and have patients inputting their own data, or maybe not even their own data, right? Maybe in the case of a parent, they're inputting data for a child, so it's not even direct input. I think there's still a really valuable space for that for research and for patients. And I think a programmer smarter than I is able to delineate that data within the same data set, so that anybody looking at the data can tell this data came from a hospital, from a researcher, this is the source of that data, as opposed to this data came directly from the patient, which is also different than this data came from a patient's device, right? Because there's more regulation around what your watch is telling a system than what a person is typing in. And you can do some things with patient-reported data, like drop-down menus and scales and all of that. But still, at the end of the day, you want them to be able to type in a little something about, well, I'm concerned about bruising, right? Maybe that's not something that's popped up on the radar yet. But there's a place in the landscape for all of that. But I think the area that we need to really focus on is that moment of input, so that we're not having to go back and try to make it align later. It's much easier to do that on the front end.
So I'll opt for the banal and obvious. I remember an early Personal Genome Project meeting, and there was an older gentleman in a wheelchair who approached George Church and said, "You're my last chance." And I thought, oh no. So I just want to encourage people to remember how we got here, and to think about, what is it about our society where every person with a rare disease is in this desperate position of starting their own advocacy group, of starting their own GoFundMe, of going around and shaking every branch, rather than sort of thinking about this as a kind of a basic element of our society.
I love that so much. I would just have to say, if we as a species were serious about solving these diseases, we would have already done it. We could just put sports on hold for a year and take all of that money and put it to cancer research.
Well, let's not get crazy.
I love sports. No, I want to also address the question of data quality, and this is also kind of a call to action. There are several people in the room that I can see right now that I've had these conversations with respect to clinical data. That is much more the Wild West with respect to harmonization. There are FHIR standards. There are, HL7, but that is like the tip of the iceberg. The data that we all need for cancer research is in the unstructured doctor's notes. And so we need to come up with a shared common data model, and that's something that we're very, very interested in. So if you are very interested in all of that, we should talk at some point.
There are and it seems that I am the negative guy today, not Misha, but anyway. There are a couple of concerns that I want to leave the audience today. Not concerns, but I guess, where do we draw the line between an individual and a patient? It's because we are talking about patient data, but actually I am potentially a patient. I'm an individual who has his genome sequence, whatever, but at some point I'm going to become a patient. And I think at the moment it's not clear to me, if I wanted to participate to some of these experiments, and I think this is perhaps to do with the barrier, lowering the barrier. I think we need to have much clearer understanding of what it is to be a patient, and perhaps it could be potentially someone who is interested to donate that as well, who doesn't express the symptoms yet. The other issue that I wanted to sort of highlight here is this sort of very blurry spectrum between analyzing your genome for fun and analyzing your genome for clinical purposes. Again, I think that there is a very blurry continuum there that depending on what questions you ask, depending on what you are interested in to find in your personal genome, you are going to have a very different set of frames upon which you can actually perform the analysis. And I think just want to hear your opinions regarding that, because I'm currently quite sort of contradicted.
Well, my father always used to say about me, often wrong but never in doubt, so I'm not conflicted. There's a lot of people here that seem to be interested in talking about issues, how patients go on and get their data into research and whatever, so why not just go on and write some guidelines for it? I mean, it turns out I'm happy to go on and put it out. I don't have to go on and get any kind of academic journal. So for people that have raised the question and are interested actually in doing something about it, show up by my poster at lunch. I'll collect all your cards. Let's see if we can put a document together. And for all these patients that want to get involved in the process, let's put together something first. If you think it's a good idea, I'll put your name on it. If you think it's a bad idea, I'll put my name on it. And then we can go on and get it out there and have the first iteration of making that happen. With respect to the gentleman that asked about HIPAA, generally, the HIPAA is interesting, but in fact, that's not what I encounter. What I encounter is when I go to a doctor, they give me a long document to sign. It's different in every single hospital, and basically the gist of it pretty much is we want to use your stuff for whatever we want to use it for, and there's a chance it'll help you, but we're not making any guarantees, and by the way, after that, it belongs to us. Now, it's a contract, okay? And in the contract, both sides are supposed to go on and get something, but it's also individualized. There's no standardized language that I've seen. So in general, what I always talk to these guys about when I read it is I strike out stuff and I write my own in and say, if it's a contract, it can be negotiated. This is what I want to have happen. And usually these people are so flustered, they just take it and go with it anyway. Okay, and that's the HIPAA thing. In terms of the data quality thing, I had that problem with my hackathon. I put this stuff out. I wound up going on and getting it back again. I was told in retrospect a lot of it was crap, so I wound up doing it again. And so finding out the right quality stuff that you have before you bring all these people in to look at it is probably important, and that'll certainly be a section of the paper that we wind up writing together in terms of advising patients to get this stuff done. So those are my comments.
And so I'm going to close by addressing the individual from the internet who wrote, I've been trying for 15 years to have a good answer to your question, and I don't yet. But you should feel free to email me. It's my last name, which is right here at Gmail, and I will connect you to the various places where you can put your data so that it at least has a chance of being used over time. With that, I'd like to thank the panel. I'd like to thank you for letting us delay your lunch by so much. Let's give ourselves a hand.